So you get out onto a site and your landowner calls you up and says, I want to restore, I want to put a wetland on my property. You know, it's like, okay, great. Where do we start? So usually what I start is when I'm talking to, usually gives me a phone call, I give him a talk, I get an idea of where he is. Sometimes I have historic photographs, which are great for references too. When I talk about reference wetlands, sometimes you can find some old photographs to give you an idea of what the historic vegetation was. The New Zealand Archives in Wellington's a great resource. This is Whakaki up in northern Hawke's Bay, the draining of Whakaki Lagoon. Landscape characteristics, we'll talk about a little bit. Aerial photos are great because I can pull an aerial photo up and say, oh, there's some open drainage there. It's flat. If you got LiDAR, it's really good because then you can see what the lay of the land is. And I look for drains on the aerial photographs. I got a drain there that shows me that there's potentially a wetland there. Sometimes when you got drains, it's not necessarily draining a wetland. Sometimes it's just draining where water sits for a week, you know. So you got to look at the depth of it. And then I just question the landowner. I just talk to him. If it's a new landowner, I don't get that. But if I got a generational family there, I just sit down and I ask them questions about the area, what they did, you know, what it was. I had one landowner wanted to restore a peat wetlands. I actually think I got a photograph of this later on today, and went out there and talked to him. And he just told me, oh, you know, this hillside here, my dad blasted with gelignite to drain the wetland, you know. So I knew like what the background was. So when I went down there, I was just, all right, there's where he drained it. That's where I got to focus my stuff. Very tough one because it was a peat lake system. Historic photographs are really good because they give you an idea of what it was before and what you're aiming to get. Again, you know, this is Burkepile Swamp, which is in Hawke's Bay. It's nice, nice little lake with this ephemeral wetlands margin that has been slowly, the wetland was drained for grazing purposes and cropping things. Like Northlands, this was really interesting when I was living in Northlands. I was working in the Hickory Swamp. It's hard to tell with this photograph, but that whole back there was a lake. It's a lake, okay? And we talked about the Hickory Swamp, and then I started talking to guys, and like, there was no lake here, but you found this old photograph, and this one little pocket in the back was actually a nice big peat lake at one time. So it's really cool to get that information. We can't restore that peat lake because now it's a dairy farm, but you know, I've got that historic information that actually there was some really cool stuff going on in that area. I look at landscape characteristics. You know, you see that's actually was an old stream bed at one time that the stream has shifted, but it was a wetland that is drained by this drain here. And you can make mistakes with historic photographs. Look at this. I got this photograph and looked at that and said, that wetland's been drained. It's been, hydrology's been altered. And but I got talking to, I tracked down the guy who took the photograph, who's an old lands and survey guy, and they just cut a track through the wetland for the lands and survey stuff. So originally when I looked at it, it's like, oh yeah, there's a drain right through there, but actually it was a perfectly intact wetland. They just cut so they could do their survey. So, you know, it's really good to have that background. Again, another, you know, I talked about this one earlier. It's just, well, I've got this drain that's constantly draining. In Northland, in the middle of the drought, this drain was draining about 7 liters per second of water, and that was all coming from the wetlands. Yeah, looking for those things, even in native bush. You did that one already. Inside streams. Sorry about that. Head cuts. And this is one thing that you got to think about. The head cut is where you've got a stream that's eroding and down cutting. Okay, and when you walk the property and the guy's like up above, he wanted to restore wetlands. And it's like, yeah, no worries. And then walk down here and saw this head cut coming up here. And it's like the first thing we got to do is stop that head cut coming up. So we should restore that wetland. In a few years, that'll cut right through the wetland, drain your wetlands. So we've got to stop that erosion going. But you see that, you see head cuts going through a lot of degraded wetlands. again, erosive streams, we get that power going through, eroding away and dropping water levels. This is classic, good aerial photograph. Like I said, I go on and look, and I've got all these, I got this whole drainage system here, and this was an old floodplain. There's where the stream was. This is where the stream is now. Another thing is when you look on maps, if you see a straight stream, you know that drainage has occurred, or if you see a stream going in at a 90-degree to another stream, there's drainage been going on. Good. I've got drainage system here, drainage system there, drainage systems all through there. Luckily, we didn't have any tile on this one. This is that one I showed you. We've got this big drain here, but you can see we've got a drain here, a drain there, and then the lay of the land flows that way. So when we wanted to restore this, we had to block those 3 drains and then the water flowing there. We still would have, this drain here, we'll still pull groundwater from this wetland unless we compact the clay in the bottom, which we didn't want to do. But we wanted to be mostly an ephemeral wetland anyway, so we didn't really worry about that drain. Next one. Yeah, again, this is great. You have actually a wetland here still because the guy built a bund here, but you can see the rest of it was drained because he wanted some wetland for duck shooting, but he still wanted to graze the rest of that wetland. So it's a highly modified wetland. Still haven't convinced him to restore that bottom section yet, but he's retired now, so hopefully we can get him on board. Historic photographs are great because we can see change in vegetation in the Hickory swamp there. This is all actually privet that was coming in, and privet needs a little bit of drier land than what you would in a wetland, so it's telling you this wetland's drying out, but you can see the drainage system. And if we go to the next photograph, I think it is. Yeah, again, nice drainage system, old floodplain. But yeah, good. The maps from the councils will show you what your drainage schemes are and where you've got drained wetlands. This is a beautiful peat wetlands. I think when NEWA did, Landcare did their measurement, they went down 17 meters of peat. And this is slowly shrinking because it's got a drain going through the middle of it. We won't talk about restoring peat wetlands because it's a little more complicated than normal wetlands, because hydrology in peat wetlands is very, very tough.
We don't have many of them in Tasman.
Yeah. It's funny, you find them in odd places though. So we won't talk about peat wetlands, but if you have a peat wetland and want to talk to me, feel free to talk to me. Again, straightened streams tell me that we got drainage going on. This is where we put that constructed wetland that I showed you earlier today through this, where my original proposal was to restore this wetland here. Still a nice piece of Kankakee bush and stuff, and but yeah, they wanted to put the NEWA wetland in there. It's a shame.
Just a comment on that. We did work on the Ruby Bay bypass. Some of you who are familiar with that, Field Creek, and we took a 1948 aerial photograph.
Yep.
We were able to see where the original meanders were. So when it came time to taking the straight stream and putting it back into a restoration plan,
yep,
we located those original meanders.
Yep. And you can see it up here a little bit. You can see the old stream meanders there. Actually, it's quite nice. I walked in through the bush and the stream meanders and almost comes back onto itself. So really the constructed wetland does follow sort of that, flying back and forth on this. But yeah, it really needs, LiDAR is really cool to do those things. I think the next one's LiDAR is a LiDAR. I know. Broken tile, always an easy one. You find a wet spot in the paddock, you start digging around, it's usually a broken tile. Yeah, naturally, these are wet areas. This is that peat wetland where the guy blasted, it was a peat lake, actually. The guy blasted through the hillside to drain it. It was quite, it was a challenging, restoration though. You look at topography, this is a beautiful forestry wetland, and I've been working with forestry the forestry companies have really gotten into the wetland restoration, and it sounds like they're getting into the wetland restoration down here. But we walked into this and they said, what are we doing? And said, well, actually, it looks like this is draining it. And then when we started looking, you could see where in the in about the 40s or 50s, there was a piece of the land came around here, and the farmer cut it through to drain that wetland at one time. He couldn't tell it really where the original levels were because it was so changed over time. But it was constantly draining this wetland, so the hydrology was completely altered. It was altered on it. It was still intact, but it just had this little bit of drain. So we went in and just put a plug in across this little bit, and it's really changed the hydrology. So it'll be really cool. We're watching how the vegetation changes with it over time. Next one. Again, topography. You see these low-lying areas generally were wetlands that were drained. Of course, it's where that campus is, there's a drain going along there, not a well-maintained one. Just walked in. This whole flat down here is an ephemeral wetland that's been drained, but you can see where he's been cleaning out the drains and draining it. He wanted to put a wetland in. He ended up, well, he put a wetland in before I got there, and he just put a bonded area in the middle of this ephemeral wetland. It's just like, you wasted a great opportunity, but working with landowners, you can't tell them those things. Altered hydrology. A lot of times, if I find Burkepile completely taking over a wetland, it tells me that the hydrology has been altered, and because they've really thrived in altered hydrology. This one has just been eroded over time, and actually, where the Ralpo is drier. The stream just works around the side of it. LiDAR is always good. It gives you where your heights are, but it's good when it comes down to planning. You can also use the LiDAR to determine, where your flats are, and how big a wetland you can put in. If you have it, it's great. If not, you just do it by hand. And actually, to be honest with you, I do it. If I have LiDAR, I go and do it on the LiDAR, but I always go out and measure it with a rod, because things on the ground are a little bit different sometimes, and LiDAR is not 100%. Again, looking at this wetland, you think it's intact, and you wouldn't even know, but it's a peat. It's a peat. What I call sloped wetlands. I don't know what you guys call it here, but it's a sea beach wetlands, and we looked at it with the forestry guys, and it's like, well, it's relatively intact. Then we started walking around, and underneath the vegetation, we had the stream in size, 0.5 meter through there, where historically that would have been just water going across that whole wetland as a sheet flow. So we had to attack it a little differently than I normally would, but it just goes to show that sometimes you got to really dig around to find out what's going on with these wetlands. And remnant vegetation, again, big nice Kikatia forest in the back indicates there was a wetland there, Kaituna wetlands. We're probably familiar with Kaituna. And then we got rushes and stuff in the paddock. So it's like, yeah, this was a historic wetland. Again, nice Kikatia stand, not a healthy stand, but there's no water there anymore. There's a 2.5 meter ditch from where I stand and taking this photograph. I mean, and the guy cleaned it out and dug deeper. And he wanted to restore this.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's a little bit of a challenge working with private landowners, but sometimes you got to walk away and say it's not possible. And you be honest with the landowners. This one, the forestry, Rainier took me to, and I looked at it, and he's been, the manager of that forest has been, this is his little pet wetland, and he's doing all this work for it, doing all this pest control and stuff. But I was looking at it and said, actually, there's some Kikatias in there, but there's a lot of Ralpo in there. There's something going on. And again, when we walk down to the bottom, there's an inside stream going right through it, just draining that wetland. So we're going to go in there and restore it, hopefully in the near future. But it's going to be a challenge because that incised wetland goes through native bush. So we're not going to be able to use a digger to do it. So I'm developing some other techniques to restore this wetland that we can do without a digger, because we can't do it with it. Yep, I've got two more. No more.
Whereabouts was that?
That was in Hawke's Bay.
Yeah, whereabouts?
That was Esk River at the Esk catchment above Eskdale. That'd be there used to be a flax mill there. I just can't think of the name of it right now. Do you know the area? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty cool. We've got tea coming on, but it's real quick. Next one, real quick. This one, the consultant took me to. They wanted to restore wetland. It was really funky because we had, it was, you can see the drain going through there. We have this going on. There's the hydrology was completely messed up on this one. And the developer wanted to develop that and create it into wetlands. Unfortunately, I moved to Hawke's Bay at the time and then didn't pursue that project, but it would have been a really neat project because we could have plugged in and created that whole area in the wetland, even though we have, the farmers in the past have dug ponds into another place where you find to restore wetlands. If you got farm ponds dug, they're usually dug in wetlands in a lot of places. Well-drained paddock, it's scrubbing, and then, yep, no, you're good. Hump and hollow, pretty typical around here. It's or not around here, but this was the Waikato, but you do find them in the West Coast and that kind of thing. Obviously, drained wetland. Next one, I think that's the last one. Yep, no, vegetation, willow weed. If I look around and I see a lot of willow weed growing, usually it tells me I've got an ephemeral wetland or I've got a drained wetland. And so it's a really good indicator. Yeah. So next one. Yeah. And then looking just at the soil profiles, you can see that this historically you can find this is actually a peat wetland, but you can look at some of the soils and say, oh, these are wetland soils. If you do a soil profile, and yeah, next one. Again, open drainage. I've talked about that one. And this is the first time this year was the first time I ever came across this, so I thought I'd throw it on. I found a buried wetland, which was really cool. If you look here, right in here, you can see the organic layer. It was a clay layer. We did we took a test and we found clay there. We're like, all right, we're good. And then when we dug down to go to this heavy clay layer, we hit a buried wetland in the middle of it, and which was really cool. You usually find buried wetlands around urban areas and cities and that kind of thing that you can excavate out. But a naturally buried wetland is just not that often found, but not found that it made a pain in the butt to restore that because we had that buried wetland in there. But yeah, really cool to see that kind of stuff, and still trying to figure out what event that was that caused it. But yeah, completely buried it with about a meter of clay soils. Nice community as well.
So what did you do? You had the your aquitard or the clay layer, and then you had the peat on top. Did you just discard the peat, or did you
So what we had at the bottom of the wetland, we dug a trench across the whole thing, and it's filled it up with clay. So
okay.
because a lot of that wetland was being drained by that historic wetlands, it was going through. But the problem was that historic wetland, you had that clay, you had that organic tree stumps. The tree stumps were just horrible. I mean, it was the wetland from hell for me. But every time we broke into that historic wetlands level, we just get this gush of water. And you want clay moist, but you don't want it wet. And so we had to stockpile clay, dig part of the trench, and fill it in really quick before fill it in with water. A bit of a challenge. I would not put that wetland with anybody who's just starting doing a wetland project. But we didn't know it was there. You know, we did everything possible. We did some samples, and I just didn't go down far enough with my samples to find that buried wetland. But it must have been a hill slip, just and covered it. Interestingly, what saved us though was it was a flat, and there was just a little hump in the middle of it, and that hump was all clay. So we actually didn't have to pull clay off from a hillside and drag it in. We could pull it off that hump, which saved us a lot of money. But it took me 2.5 days to restore the hydrology or get the hydrology right on that one. Next one.